Charleston, South Carolina. My card flashed declined. Just as I tried to pay for the dinner I'd brought for everyone, the paper bag still warm against my wrist. For a moment the room went strangely quiet, only the soft hum of Mark's refrigerator and the clatter of Brianna's bracelets as she crossed her arms. On the dining table, beneath a stack of unopened mail, lay a document with a thick black signature stretched across the bottom. Reduction of widows' rights, proposed by Mark Hanlon. Before I could ask what it meant, Mark pushed his chair back and said, in front of everyone, "Mom, you're just the widow now. Sit down and stay quiet." Someone laughed softly. Someone else avoided my eyes. No one mentioned the decades I had spent building everything around us, the marina, the house, the accounts that kept them all afloat. I stood there, surrounded by warm bread and cold disrespect, feeling the sting settle deep in my chest. And one thought rose above all the noise. How could they do this to me? If moments like this have ever brushed against your life, stay close. Here we speak aloud the truths others try to quietly erase. My name is Grace Hanlon, and I was 67 years old that summer evening when my own son told me to sit down and be quiet. The words stung, but they were not born in that moment. They had grown slowly, in the shadows of years when my work was taken for granted and my care was treated like a background hum, as constant and unnoticed as the refrigerator in my kitchen. For 3 decades I managed every dollar that passed through the Hanlon home. While my late husband, Thomas, repaired boats under the Charleston sun, I sat at the little oak desk by the window with a calculator, a ledger, and a chipped blue mug of coffee. I paid invoices, negotiated with suppliers, and learned which banks would extend a line of credit when a storm season destroyed half the marina. My signature saved our home more times than Thomas ever knew. Thomas was a good man, but he lived in the world of engines and hulls, not papers and interest rates. "You always were the clever one, Gracie," he'd say, pressing a grease-stained kiss to my forehead as I balanced the accounts late at night. He trusted me with everything. The mortgage, the insurance, the payroll for the boys who worked the docks. I learned to read contracts the way he read tide charts. Without my careful lists and sleepless nights, that marina would have closed in 1996, again in 2008, and certainly during the pandemic. I spoke calmly to bankers who did not expect a woman my age to understand loan covenants. I cut expenses where it hurt me, not them. I patched together our life with coupons and second-hand furniture, so that the business could stay open and Mark could go to college on time. Mark grew up believing the light simply stayed on. Birthdays arrived with cakes, braces appeared on his teeth, and tuition was paid. He saw his father's name on the sign at the marina and assumed that was where the power lived. He did not see me at the kitchen table, turning a stack of overdue notices into a current account by the end of the week. Children rarely notice the hands that steady the ground beneath them. To my son and his wife, I became something quiet and automatic. The person who watched Layla after school, the woman who always had a casserole in the freezer, the one who could be asked with a sigh and a laugh, "Mom, could you help us out just this once?" I was the emergency fund they did not have to build for themselves. Brianna came into the family with glossy hair, sharp heels, and sharper opinions. She preferred restaurant dinners to pot roast at my table, and direct deposits to small envelopes of cash. To her, work was only real if it produced a title and a salary slip. Since mine produced neither, it was invisible. When they needed help with a down payment, they called me. When their car broke down, it was my credit card that reserved the rental so Mark could get to work. When daycare costs rose, I quietly rearranged my own budget so I could keep Layla 3 afternoons a week without charging them a cent. They thanked me, yes, but the thanks slid away as quickly as the next request arrived. "You're so good with money, Grace," Brianna would say, handing me another bill to look over. What she meant was, "Pay this for us, absorb it into that invisible well you always seem to have." I let it happen, telling myself this was what mothers did. Thomas would have wanted me to help them, I thought. Family first. But there is a difference between helping and being used. Somewhere along the way, Mark stopped asking if it was convenient. Brianna stopped pretending it embarrassed her. My time, my labor, my savings, they became assumed, expected. A quiet tax on my own old age. To them, I was part of the furniture of their lives. Solid, dependable, unremarkable. A background hum. Convenient. Replaceable. They were wrong about that. What they never understood was that I carried every risk on my shoulders. If a loan defaulted, it was my name on the paperwork. When storms tore through the docks, it was my emergency fund that filled the gap until insurance paid. While they bought new phones and weekend trips, I quietly patched the roof and kept the lights on at the marina. I am no martyr, I chose this. I believed in building something that would outlast us, a place Mark could one day point to and say, "My parents built this together." I thought steady love would be remembered fairly. Even after Thomas died, I kept my routines. On the first Monday of every month, I wrote out the numbers. Marina income, taxes, insurance, utilities, the little college fund for Layla that I fed with whatever was left. I called Mark with updates, but he was always busy, always about to jump into a meeting. "Just handle it, Mom," he'd say. "You always do." So I did. To myself, I was a partner, a steward, the quiet spine of our family's life. To them, I was something else entirely. An aging widow with retirement money. Convenient. Expendable. Still. A year before everything shattered, Thomas was still alive, moving more slowly but still insisting on polishing the brass cleats on the boats that came into the marina. He liked the ritual, the way metal grew warm under his hands. I remember standing beside him one humid afternoon, handing him the rag he kept in his back pocket, when Brianna walked down the dock in wedge sandals that wobbled on the planks. She joined us with a smile that felt too bright, like it had been switched on for an audience. Mark trailed behind her, absorbed in his phone. The wind smelled of salt and diesel, and somewhere a gull cried out as if trying to warn us. Brianna sighed dramatically, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "When all this finally goes to Mark," she said, gesturing vaguely at the boats, "the marina office, the old wooden sign bearing our family name, we'll finally live properly." Thomas froze. Just for a second. His hand hovered over the brass cleat, the rag half wrapped around it. He didn't look at her. He looked at me. I felt my stomach tighten, the way it does when a pot begins to boil but no one has turned the heat down yet. I forced a polite smile and said nothing. I told myself she didn't mean it the way it sounded. Young people talk carelessly, that was the story I clung to. I blamed the humidity, the long week, anything other than intent. But the words clung to me like the smell of the engine room. Thick, unpleasant, impossible to wash away. When all this finally goes to Mark. Not when Thomas and I retire. Not when we pass things down together. Not even when the time comes. No, she meant when he is gone. When I am sidelined. When Mark becomes the sole owner of work Thomas and I built with bruised hands and sleepless nights. Thomas wiped the cleat twice more, slower than before. Then he said quietly, "Let's head in, Gracie. Storm's coming." The sky was clear, but we went anyway. I told myself Brianna had been joking. She laughed afterward, as if she hadn't noticed the tension she carved into the air. Mark didn't even look up from his phone. "She's just teasing," he said as they walked ahead of us toward the office. But later that night, when Thomas and I were alone, he set a cup of tea beside me and asked, "Did that sit right with you?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to keep peace, keep harmony, keep pretending every offhand comment was harmless. But the truth sat heavy on my tongue. "No," I whispered. "It didn't." Thomas nodded once, slowly. His eyes were tired, the way they got when numbers didn't add up or when a storm chart looked wrong. "We'll keep an eye on things," he said. "People show their intentions long before they act on them." I didn't press him on what he meant. I folded the moment away like a letter I wasn't ready to open. In the months that followed, that sentence greeted me at odd moments. While sorting receipts, while locking the marina office at dusk, while folding laundry still warm from the dryer. It wasn't loud. It hovered like a faint echo I tried to ignore. I watched Brianna laugh too loudly at gatherings, her eyes scanning for what might benefit her. I watched Mark adopt her phrases, her assumptions, her impatience with anything that didn't center their comfort. I tried to brush it all aside. I told myself families go through phases. I told myself Thomas would steady the ship, that we would ride out whatever this was. But sometimes, late at night, I caught him studying old documents with a seriousness he didn't explain. He would close the folders when I walked into the room and smile too quickly, as if he didn't want to worry me. Once, I found him at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, tracing his finger over the deed to the marina like a man memorizing the contours of something he feared losing. "Just checking things," he said when I asked. His voice was gentle, but it carried a weight I didn't yet understand. The crack was there. thin, nearly invisible but present. And though I didn't know it then, that quiet shift, those 12 careless words, were the beginning of everything that would come to light. Even now, when I think back, I recall how the dock felt beneath my feet that day. Steady, sun-warmed, familiar. I realize how easily we mistake steady things for permanent ones. I thought our family foundation was sound, built on years of shared work and trust. I didn't see how a single careless sentence could slide into the grain of our lives like water seeping into wood, swelling it, weakening it, preparing it to split. Looking back, it was all there. I simply wasn't ready to face it. In those days, I still believed small hurts could be smoothed over with patience. I believed that if I stayed steady, others would remember what steadiness looked like. But something subtle had already shifted. Respect, once taken for granted, had begun to evaporate. And the first crack, hairline and quiet, waited for its chance to widen. Yet, after Thomas passed, the house felt too quiet. The scent of his cedar shaving soap lingered on the bathroom shelf, and his work boots stayed by the back door for months. I kept moving through routines because they were the only things that still held their shape. But around me, the family's shape began to shift in ways I pretended not to see. It started small, the sort of things you could excuse if you wanted to. And I wanted to. Grief softens boundaries until everything feels forgivable. The first missed invitation came in spring. Mark mentioned a beach weekend only after they returned. It was last minute, he said. Didn't want to bother you. I nodded, even though the calendar on my kitchen wall was blank. Layla later told me they planned it for weeks. She whispered it, eyes down, as if the truth were contraband. Then there were the bills. Since you have retirement money, Brianna said lightly, sliding an envelope across my table while I was still wearing my apron. The envelope was for their car insurance. I told myself it was temporary. I covered it, then another. Each one disguised as practicality, never gratitude. Brianna's eyes changed when she looked at me. Once we had cooked together, she chopping onions while I stirred a pot of stew. But now, whenever I spoke, she let out a sigh, small but sharp, as if my words took up air she needed. The sound clung to the corners of the room long after she left. Mark became careless with the marina keys. He didn't ask before taking them. He simply assumed they were his. I'd find them missing and call him, and he'd reply, "Relax, Mom. I'll bring them back." Except sometimes he wouldn't, and I'd have to drive to the docks at night, the metal cold in my hand as I locked what he left open. The changes were quiet, but they stacked. A missing invitation. A rolled eye. A bill pushed across the table. Little things, but little things accumulate like silt until a river changes course. The worst part was Layla. She grew wary in ways a child shouldn't. When she visited, she hugged me tightly, then glanced over her shoulder as if checking who saw it. "I'm not supposed to tell you stuff," she whispered once, her small hands twisted in the hem of her shirt. I asked what she meant, but she only shook her head and went still. I began noticing patterns. When I entered a room, conversations hushed. When I offered help, they insisted they didn't need it, only to ask for money the next day. When I gave advice, Mark smiled without hearing a word. "We've got it handled," he'd say. "Just enjoy retirement." As if I were a guest in my own life. One evening, I brought over a casserole, Thomas's recipe, the one with thyme and white wine he always made on cold nights. Brianna didn't take the dish from my hands. She just looked at it and said, "We already ordered takeout." No thank you. No warmth. Just dismissal. I drove home with the casserole cooling on the passenger seat, the smell filling the car with memories of a man they seemed to be forgetting. I tried to tell myself Mark was grieving in his own way, that Brianna was overwhelmed, that Layla was caught in the middle. But the truth pressed in quietly. They were building a life that did not include me, except where it benefited them. On rainy mornings, I found myself standing by the window, listening to the soft patter on the glass. The house echoed differently now. I noticed how the refrigerator hummed louder when I was alone, how the clock ticked more boldly, as if marking time I was no longer invited to share. Each slight hurt more than it should have, not because of cruelty but because of accumulation. 1,000 shallow cuts cut deeper than one. By summer, the distance between us had grown into something solid. I could feel it whenever I stepped into their home. A thin film of coldness coating the air, subtle but unmistakable. They didn't say anything outright. They didn't need to. Their silence did the speaking for them. And I, foolish in my hope, kept trying to mend something I didn't yet realize they'd already decided to break. There were moments when I tried to address it gently. Once while clearing dinner plates I said, "I feel like things are different between us." Mark didn't look up from his phone. "You're overthinking," he muttered. Brianna gathered the silverware with a clatter that felt intentional. The conversation ended before it began. Another time I offered to take Layla school shopping. It had always been our tradition. New notebooks, a fresh set of pencils, and one fun surprise she picked herself. But Brianna replied curtly, "We'll handle it." Later, Layla told me she missed our trips. She said it in a whisper like everything she said to me then. It was becoming clear. I was only welcome in the spaces where my wallet fit. Everywhere else, my presence had become an inconvenience. I kept a brave face. I cooked, I visited, I brought small gifts for Layla, I asked about their week. But every time I left their house, I sat in my car a few extra minutes before turning the key, swallowing the sting that grew heavier each visit. And somewhere deep down, I began to understand that the family I thought I had was slowly replacing me with a version they could control, quiet, compliant, and endlessly giving. A version that was disappearing. The night of the dinner, the one that began with my card flashing, declined. The air inside Mark's house felt heavy, as if it already knew what was coming. I set the takeout bags on the counter, the smell of rosemary chicken rising into a room that did not greet me. Brianna barely glanced up from her phone. Mark paced near the dining table, shuffling a stack of papers with the kind of eagerness people reserve for victories. I should have felt the warning then, but I tried to stay steady. We sat. Plates passed. Conversations skirted around real things. Layla pushed peas across her plate without eating. When I asked her what was wrong, she whispered, "Nothing, Grandma." But her eyes flicked to her parents. Then, with the timing of someone rehearsed, Mark cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, sliding the stack of papers toward me, "we need you to sign something. It'll simplify inheritance for everyone. We're trying to take the stress off you." I reached for the top page. The paper was thick, the kind lawyers choose, the sort that feels important before you even read the words. Under the bold header, "Transfer of Ownership," I saw the marina's name, the parcel numbers of our land, and the list of accounts Thomas and I had spent decades building. All of it. Everything. "Mark," I murmured, my finger tracing a line I wished I didn't understand. "This moves the business to you." He smiled. Too quickly. "It's just a formality. Dad would have wanted this." My pulse thudded in my ears. Then why wasn't I told about it? Brianna leaned forward, folding her hands with practiced patience. "Grace, please. We all know keeping up with this stuff is hard for you now. This just keeps things clean. You'll still be supported." Supported. As if I were a burden they were preparing to shoulder. I looked down again. That's when I saw it, bottom right corner, dated August 12, 2024, Thomas's signature. Except it wasn't. My husband had signed thousands of invoices, paychecks, and contracts in his lifetime. I knew the weight of his pen strokes the way some wives know their husbands laugh. The signature on that page was bolder, the loops wrong, the name slanted upward as if climbing out of guilt. My stomach tightened. "This isn't his," I said quietly. Mark's jaw tensed. "Mom, don't start." "I'm not starting," I whispered. "I'm recognizing." He pushed back his chair, frustration rising. "You're overthinking again. Dad signed it. End of story." Brianna gave a short, humorless laugh. "Honestly, Grace, it's embarrassing that you're making this difficult. We're offering to take responsibility off your shoulders." Responsibility. As if I hadn't carried every weight this family ever had. I set the paper down. "I'm not signing." Silence cracked through the room. Brianna's expression sharpened. Mark's face darkened. "Mom," he said slowly, "don't make this ugly." "I'm not the one making anything ugly," I replied, though my voice stayed soft. "I'm asking why you put a forged signature in front of me." Brianna snapped. "Nobody forged anything. Just sign. You don't even use the marina anymore." Layla's fork clattered to the table. She stared at me, eyes wide and frightened. My hands were steady, though my heart wasn't. "I'm taking these home," I said, gathering the papers. "You're not," Mark said, placing his hand on the stack to hold it down. They stay here. We locked eyes. The boy I raised, who once cried into my shoulder after his first broken bone, looked at me with something cold, transactional, unfamiliar. Then I'll remember every word, I said softly. Brianna rose abruptly. You're making this dramatic. You're a widow now, Grace. Things change. It's time you let go of this illusion of control. The word landed like a slap. Widow. Not mother. Not partner in a life built from nothing. Widow, as if that made me powerless. Disposable. Done. My breath caught, but I didn't let them see it break me. I simply stood, gathered my purse, and placed the uneaten dinner rolls back into the bag. Mark muttered. This would have been easier if you cooperated. I said nothing. I walked to the door, the papers left behind but burning into my memory. Behind me, chairs scraped, someone sighed in irritation, someone else whispered. But none of it touched me. I stepped outside into the warm Charleston night, cicadas humming, the sky soft and dark. The insult, the forged signature, the entitlement, they circled in my mind, settling into a place I hadn't known was waiting. Something inside me gave way. Quietly. Cleanly. Not a cry. Not a scream. Just a snap, deep, internal, decisive. The kind that doesn't heal back the same. That night, when I finally stepped back into my own house, the air felt different. Still cautious. As if even the walls sensed the shift inside me. I set my purse down on the entry table, the one Thomas built from reclaimed dock wood, and I stood there for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. It sounded louder than usual, steady and indifferent. I walked to the bedroom, still half hoping the evening had been some strange misunderstanding. But the echo of Brianna's voice followed me. You're a widow now. As if widow meant anchorless. As if losing Thomas had emptied me of judgment, of competence, of memory. I reached for the pearl earrings Thomas had given me on our 20th anniversary. They were delicate, smooth, familiar against my fingertips. I removed them one by one and placed them gently in the top drawer of my dresser. For years that drawer had remained open, filled with small things I used daily, hair ties, receipts, old photographs. But tonight I slid it shut. And then without planning to, I locked it. The small click was soft, but it echoed through me. It felt symbolic, almost ceremonial, closing away the last part of myself they still believed they could reach. I kept moving through the house, turning off lights, folding a throw blanket, straightening a frame on the wall. Small motions kept my hands busy while my thoughts settled into a new, unfamiliar clarity. Every corner of the house carried a memory of Thomas, the indentation on the couch cushion where he'd nap after long days, the coffee mug with the chipped rim he refused to throw out. For a moment the grief swelled again, sharp and fresh. But tonight grief wasn't alone. Something else had risen to meet it. Resolve. I sat at the kitchen table, the one where Thomas and I had spent nights going over ledgers, signing contracts, planning futures. I rested my hands flat on the wood. The image of that forged signature came back to me, so brazen, so careless, so sure I would accept it. My son believed I would look at a lie and nod along. Brianna believed I would be grateful for their scraps. They both believed my loneliness made me pliable. But sitting in that quiet kitchen, I realized something I should have seen months ago. They were not confused. They were not overwhelmed. They were not acting out of grief. They were acting out of expectation. Expectation that I would hand over everything with a trembling thank you. Expectation that age had softened me into someone harmless. Expectation that because Thomas was gone, I must be directionless. They miscalculated. Near midnight, I walked to the hallway closet and reached for the small cedar chest tucked on the top shelf. Thomas had built it the year Mark was born. He carved our initials into the lid, T&G, intertwined like a knot. I hadn't opened it since the funeral. My hand shook slightly as I lowered it onto the bed. For a long time I simply looked at it, my fingers tracing the carved letters. Then with a breath that felt like stepping over a threshold, I lifted the lid. Inside were folders, envelopes, and documents Thomas had organized meticulously. Insurance papers, deeds, old bank statements. And then, near the bottom, a single envelope marked in his handwriting. For Grace. Open if they start pressing you. My breath stilled. I slid my thumb under the seal, slow and careful, as if the envelope were a living thing. Inside were notarized papers, dated a year before his death. Papers stating in clear legal language that everything belongs solely to me, with no transfer permitted without my explicit consent. No loopholes. No alternate signatures. No shared control. Thomas had known. Maybe not the details but the possibility. He'd seen what I refused to see. He'd prepared for a moment he hoped would never come. Tears rose quiet and hot. Not from sorrow but from recognition. My husband, even at the end, had been steady. He had left me a safeguard. A map out of the darkness. I set the papers down gently, smoothing their edges. In the stillness of my bedroom, I felt something shift, subtle but unmistakable. This will not continue. The thought came calmly, like a tide returning after a storm. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't planning confrontation. I was planning alignment of truth, of ownership of what Thomas entrusted to me. At 3:11 a.m. I turned on the lamp, its warm glow filling the room. The decision crystallized like frost on glass. I picked up the envelope, folded it neatly, and placed it into my purse. Then I whispered to the empty room, to the man whose handwriting still guided me. I know what I need to do. And for the first time in months I felt steady again. I woke before dawn, not to grief this time but to purpose. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:11 a.m. Outside Charleston was quiet, the kind of silence that comes before first light. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment, feeling the cool wood beneath my feet and the weight of the choice I had already made. Then I reached for my purse. The envelope with Thomas's handwriting lay where I had tucked it, edges square, his name steady across the front. I carried it to the kitchen and set it beside my old finance notebook, the same one I'd used for decades to track every payment, every late fee, every saved dollar. I brewed a small pot of coffee, just enough for one, and sat at the table where so many of our decisions had been made. On a clean page I wrote the date, August 15, 2024. Under it I drew a line down the middle and made two headings. On the left, what they think they control. On the right, what I actually control. Under their side I wrote, Marina Land Accounts House, Widow. Under mine I wrote, legal ownership, authorizations, signatures, power of attorney. My voice, seeing it laid out in ink, brought a calm I could feel in my hands. For so long I had allowed myself to be treated as an accessory to my own work. That ended now. The sky outside began to lighten to a faint gray. I opened the documents Thomas had left and read them slowly, line by line. There it was in black and white. I was the sole owner. Transfers required my explicit consent. Any attempt to move assets without me was invalid. Thomas had trusted me while he was alive, and he had trusted me after. He had seen, or at least suspected, what grief and greed might invite. When the clock on the stove clicked over to 6:58 a.m., I picked up the phone and dialed our attorney's direct line. I expected to leave a message. Instead, he answered, voice still thick with sleep. Grace? No, I said, steady. It's not all right. I found the envelope. I need to activate what Thomas put in place. There was a pause, the sound of rustling. Tell me what happened. So I did. I told him about the dinner, the documents, the forged signature dated August 12th, the pressure, the way they used the word widow like an insult. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he exhaled. Thomas was very specific when we drafted those papers. If anything like this happened, you were to call me. We'll lock everything down. Good, I replied. Let's begin. The rest of the morning moved like a quiet storm front. While most of the neighborhood was pouring cereal and packing lunches, I was on the phone with banks and brokers, each call a simple correction. I confirmed that all primary accounts remained in my name, and instructed that no changes were to be made without my authorization. I removed Mark's backup access that had once been offered as a kindness. I requested dual verification on large transfers. I asked the Marina's accountant to send all reports back to me alone, as it had been before. No threats. No raised voice. Just precise requests, one after another, made by the person who actually held authority. At 9, I drove to the attorney's office with Thomas's folder on the passenger seat. The building's air conditioning met me at the door. In a small conference room, we spread the documents out across the table. He compared signatures, checked seals, made copies. What they tried to do wouldn't have stood in court, he said, tapping the forged page I had described. But we're going to make sure they never get close again. He slid another form toward me. This tells every institution involved that no transfer, refinance, or title change is valid without your confirmed consent. It also authorizes us to respond formally if they attempt anything else. I read it. Then I signed. My hand was steady. By late morning, the framework was in place. The marina, the land, the house, the business accounts, they had always been mine in law. Now they were shielded in practice. Back at the kitchen table that afternoon, I opened my notebook again and added a third heading. Next steps. Remove Mark from all remaining access. Secure originals in a safe deposit box. Update my will. Decide how and whether to speak to them. My phone buzzed. Mark's name lit the screen. Mom, we need to finish that paperwork. Call me. His text read a moment later. I let myself feel the sting for exactly one breath. Then I answered. We will not be finishing that paperwork. All matters regarding the business, the land, and the house are now handled through my attorney. I added the office number and pressed send. No explanation. No apology. Then I turned the phone face down and folded my hands on the table. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I didn't beg them to see my worth. I simply stepped into what was already mine and closed the door behind me. I felt very calm. The consequences did not arrive with drama or shouting. They came quietly, procedurally, like tides turning in the dark. By the time Mark and Brianna realized what had shifted beneath their feet, the ground had already moved. It began 48 hours after that dinner. I was making tea when my phone buzzed with a flurry of messages, 3 missed calls from Mark, then one from the marina's accountant. Grace, he said, your son is here insisting he still has access. Should I call security? I told him calmly, no. Simply inform him the accounts have been frozen pending a legal review. And please make a record of his visit. By noon, Mark texted again. What did you do? My business card isn't working. Then another. I have payments pending. Fix this. There was no question mark. No respect. Just expectation. I didn't answer. Meanwhile, Brianna stormed into the bank, demanding to be listed as an authorized user, waving screenshots of account balances she believed were hers by proximity. But the manager, following the instructions I'd filed earlier that morning, told her politely that no changes could be made without my physical presence and identification. Silence followed, sharp as broken glass. Later that afternoon, I received an email alert. An attempted login to the marina's financial portal from Mark's device. It had been blocked. Another alert. A request to transfer funds out of the maintenance account. Blocked again. Their confidence had made them sloppy. By evening, the attorney called. Grace, they tried to file a claim stating you were unfit to manage your affairs. I closed my eyes. Of course they did. He continued, Mrs. Hanlon, they submitted a fabricated psychiatric assessment. The betrayal burned but not hot, steady measured. Something I recognized now instead of shrinking beneath. They forged the doctor's signature, he said. It's a criminal matter. Handle it, I replied. Do whatever is required. The next morning, an officer arrived at Brianna and Mark's house with a warrant. Neighbors peeked through their blinds as Brianna stood on the porch, arms tightly crossed, voice trembling despite her attempts at poise. I wasn't there, but small towns carry news like wind carries sand. I heard she tried to call it a misunderstanding. Forgery rarely is. Mark wasn't arrested, but the damage unfurled in other ways. By week's end, his business credit lines collapsed due to instability of ownership. The property he assumed he was inheriting was legally reaffirmed as mine. The house they lived in, partly funded by me, was tied back to my estate, undoing whatever quiet paperwork he'd hoped would stand. On Friday he called. I let it ring until the 4th attempt. Then I answered. His voice was strained. Mom, just talk to me. I did talk, I said softly. You just didn't listen. He inhaled sharply. We were trying to secure the future. You're acting like we attacked you. You forged your father's name, I replied. You treated me like an obstacle when I spent my life being a foundation. There was a long pause. Then a defeated. So what happens now? Whatever happens, I said, happens because of choices you made. I hung up, not out of anger but completion. Something inside me settled into its rightful shape. Brianna's arrest stirred whispers through town. At the grocery store, two women murmured near the citrus display. "Did you hear what she tried to pull with her mother-in-law?" I didn't slow. I didn't correct them. Truth no longer needed my protection. Inside their home, tension thickened. Layla later told me she heard shouting behind closed doors. Accusations thrown without aim, each one revealing what fear had hollowed inside them. While their world buckled inward, I remained still. The fallout reached further than they expected. Mark's coworkers started keeping distance. Suppliers refused him credit, citing authorization concerns. Even the marina staff, usually polite but detached, began calling me directly, with a respect they seemed to have rediscovered. And perhaps the cruelest consequence was the simplest. They realized I was no longer predictable, no longer an open pocket or a quiet wall to lean against. They had mistaken kindness for weakness. They had mistaken age for surrender. And without my silence to hold them up, their structure sagged inward piece by piece, just as structures do when the beam that supports them quietly steps away. In the weeks that followed, the noise around Mark and Brianna grew louder, but my own life grew quieter in a way that felt deliberate. Not empty, just intentionally arranged. For the first time in months, I woke without a knot settling under my ribs. The house felt different, not because anything had changed inside it, but because I finally understood that it was mine in every sense that mattered. My days became slow, steady, and my own. I opened windows in the mornings and let the coastal air drift through the rooms. I made coffee in Thomas's chipped mug not out of habit or grief, but because I liked the weight of it in my hand. I started clearing out closets, not in a frantic way, but with calm purpose, deciding what deserved to stay in my future. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of old paperwork, I found a photograph of Layla at 7 years old, standing on the dock with a life vest 2 sizes too big. She was grinning, gap-toothed and unguarded. I felt a soft tug behind my ribs. She had been the one person who never changed her tone with me, never adopted her parents' clipped politeness or silent judgments. Even when she was told to keep distance, she found ways to bridge it. I called my attorney that afternoon. "Transfer the cottage," I said. "The one outside town. Put it in her name." He hesitated. "Grace, she's still a minor." "Then structure it in trust," I replied. "But make it clear it's hers. She deserved one place chosen for her out of love, not ownership." The cottage sat near the marshlands, small and sunlit, with peeling white paint and a screened porch that hummed in the summer. It wasn't much, but it was steady. When I told Layla the next weekend, her eyes widened. "For me," she whispered. "Yes," I said. "For you." She hugged me fiercely, both arms tight. In that moment, I realized I wasn't rebuilding alone. She was part of the new foundation forming around me. Not long after, I made the decision to sell the marina. It wasn't easy. The place held decades of my life. I could still picture Thomas repairing boats under the Carolina sun, grease on his collar, laughter in his voice. But the marina belonged to our past, and I needed something that carried our legacy forward, rather than holding me in place. The day the sale finalized, I stood at the water's edge, watching the tide pull gently against the pilings. "Thank you," I whispered, not to the place but to the years it gave us. Then I turned and walked away without looking back. With the proceeds, I opened the Tom Hanlon Legacy Fund, a small program offering support to widows whose families tried to erase them after the husband passed. The letters began arriving within days. Quiet stories, private stories, women who recognized the shape of what I'd lived. Helping them didn't drain me. It steadied me. Meanwhile, I found a small house near the bay. It wasn't large, but it had windows that caught the morning light and a kitchen that felt warm even when empty. The first night I slept there, the only sounds were the distant horn of a ship and the rustle of wind through the marsh grass. The quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt like a long exhale. I hung one photograph on the living room wall, Thomas leaning against the old marina sign, smiling at me as if he just told a joke. I lit a lavender candle beneath it. The scent filled the room like soft memory. Here, I wasn't anyone's afterthought or resource. I was Grace, fully, quietly, and without apology. I spent the next mornings establishing routines that belonged only to me. I walked along the shoreline at sunrise, the damp sand cool beneath my shoes. I started keeping fresh flowers on the counter, Nothing extravagant, just wild blooms from the market. In the afternoons, I volunteered at a community center, helping women sort through paperwork they'd been too overwhelmed to face alone. Sometimes I'd pause in the middle of the day listening, but the old ache didn't rise. Instead, I felt possibility stretching out quietly, like new tide lines forming on sand that had been undisturbed for too long. My life was no longer defined by what had been taken from me. It was defined by what I chose to build next. Some nights, when the bay is calm and the house settles into its quiet, I think back to that dinner. The word widow tossed at me like it meant finished. I remember the cold disrespect, the forged signature, the way a family can twist into something unrecognizable when greed takes the lead. But now, standing in the soft glow of my own home, I understand something simple. It doesn't matter who tries to shrink you. What matters is who you become when you refuse to disappear. I didn't rise loudly. I rose by choosing myself, my voice, my steadiness, my future. And in doing so, I stepped out of the shadow they built for me. To anyone who knows the sting of being dismissed, you are not done. You are not small. You are allowed to reclaim your name, your place, your peace. If this touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength.